be here as your host and moderator. My name is Paddy Siyanga Knudsen, and we have quite a packed agenda, but also a very dynamic conversation that will take place in a bit. But before we will step into that space, maybe it's good for us to do just a little bit of housekeeping and check on how everyone is doing. A few housekeeping rules would sort of help us a bit. We would like to invite participants who are sitting and joining us from various spaces to just feel free to engage with us on the chat function. We have a Q&A, so you can engage with us there as we will proceed. But for now, just as we wait for everyone to settle in the room, I see our count is at 147, 148 even as I speak. Just to sign Bram if we're good enough for us to go and do our opening remarks, since we have all our panelists and our speakers with us here today. Bram, are we good to go? All right, super. So, it's a very packed report, a very packed agenda as well for today. But I think it's very important that we just take a few moments for us to listen to important organizations that are behind the Mixed Migration Center. And so I want to call upon Charlotte Slente, who is the Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council, to share her opening remarks. Charlotte.
Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. And I'm very, very honored to be here today to open this event, and would like to express my gratitude both to the panelists who have come today, but also to the participants that are being with us virtually today. Actually, this year has been a very challenging one. We have seen around the world new conflicts emerging and related displacement to these conflicts. We've seen ongoing public health threats. We have also seen increased levels of environmental stresses, and we have seen changing trends and policies when it comes to migration. So particularly as asylum seekers and refugees and migrants, they have continued to experience increased hardship as it is. So in this rapidly changing world, it is only befitting that our overarching lens of this year's Mixed Migration Review is reframing the human mobility. I believe the report is very essential reading. Through 5 stories taken from in-depth interviews with refugees and migrants, it offers us a window into the lives of women, men, and children whose safety and whose aspirations are directly affected by migration policies and practices. And these insights into the very real impact of policies across contexts is ever more important in a time where political efforts to contain refugees and migrants outside own borders means that the suffering and the rights violations that people on the move live through happens more out of sight, maybe, than they used to do. The Mixed Migration Review also challenges and adds nuance to preconceived perceptions of global mobility through alternative narratives delivered by voices of experts and regional researchers in individual interviews. Like previous years, the Mixed Migration Reviews, which is called the Normalizing of the Extreme section, offers a very sobering account of current unsettling global policy trends. So the increasingly securitized and militarized borders, pushbacks, refoulement, and denial of entry, they actually stand out. A welcome addition to this year's Mixed Migration Review is the accompanying section on the resisting the extreme. That actually details positive developments related to mixed migration that are also emerging. To make headway towards better migration management, we need to carve out space also for the positive stories and outcomes of mobility. DRC is very proud to be hosting the Mixed Migration Center. The center plays a key role in the organization through data, research and analysis at global and regional levels. It contributes to DRC's evidence-based programming in support of people on the move, and also our evidence-based policy and advocacy at all levels of the organization. Importantly, the Mixed Migration Center does not only play this role within DRC, but also in partnership with many other organizations and as a service to the broader sector. And this is exactly what we hoped for when we established the Mixed Migration Center. So I invite you all to explore the essays, the interviews, the data, the stories from refugees and migrants in the Mixed Migration Review 2021. Together, we need to continue to make that extra effort to seek a more nuanced understanding of the circumstances and needs of people on the move, and to contribute to dignified responses and solutions. So I wish you a very fruitful meeting and launch with us today, this afternoon, Copenhagen time. Thank you very much.
Charlotte, thank you for that. And thank you for the invitation. I think in exploring that heavy volume of a report, I only saw it physically via Zoom call and look forward to have a physical copy. But even the online versions that have already been circulated since this morning, I think on the MMC website, already, I think, a testament of the depth in which the report has gone into. So thank you for that invitation. And I would just like to call upon from the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the head of migration and forced displacement section, Odile Inauen, to just give us her opening remarks. Odile, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the MMC, it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon for the launch of the 21 Mixed Migration Review. As you know, Switzerland has been a long-standing partner of the MMC since the very beginning. We support MMC's work dedicated to sharpen a collective understanding of the complex mixed migration phenomenon. We also wish to acknowledge our co-donors, Danida and the Bosch Foundation, who join us in supporting these efforts. This year's review rightly frames mixed migration in the context of key global trends such as climate change or the global pandemic. We congratulate MMC and all the experts who have contributed to this review. Your work is crucial to inform policymakers with nuanced analysis and is very valuable to us for different reasons. First, Switzerland attaches particular importance to an evidence-based dialogue on migration. We're working with different partners, including the UN system, on strengthening the global evidence base on migration. We are convinced that the policy approaches to migration must be as diverse as the different drivers of migration are. Second, the Mixed Migration Review is handy. While the articles are academic in nature, they are presented in an accessible and reader-friendly format that is appealing to a broad audience. If facts and figures are important, so do perspectives. We welcome the essay competition integrated in this year's review that gives a voice to young researchers from the Global South. These stories from Brazil and Colombia to Nigeria and Senegal unveil hidden realities and perspectives from people living, studying, and working in countries with high migration pressures. Third, we also welcome the deep dives into other topics that align with Switzerland's thematic priorities, such as the plight of migrants who die or go missing along migratory routes. Switzerland supports ICRC and other partners, such as the International Commission on Missing Persons, in their efforts to establish cooperation mechanisms for the research, the identification, and the information to family members left behind. Let me conclude by saying that we are proud to support the migration ecosystem and expertise in Geneva, of which MMC constitutes an integral part. We would like also to encourage all member states to actively invite researchers to inform our policy discussions, such as in regional consultative processes. It's our hope that this research will contribute to effective policy responses for the protection of the most vulnerable and also for maximizing the benefits of migration for societies overall. And I thank you very much.
Odile, thank you for sharing those insights and as part of your opening remarks. And now I would like to call upon Bram Frouws to join us and kind of share with us in his remarks as well, giving us a bit of a snippet into what the report looks like before we will get into the meat of the discussion. And Bram is the head of the Mixed Migration Center. Bram, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Odile, for your opening remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening, everyone. Also, on behalf of the Mixed Migration Center, I would like to welcome everyone at the launch of the Mixed Migration Review 2021. I'm very happy and proud to present to you today the 2021 edition of our flagship annual report, which went, as Paddy said, online a few hours ago this morning. When we started this series of annual reviews, annual reports 4 years ago, we hoped this would become an annual landmark review on mixed migration. And if I see the interest to attend the launch event today, with actually already hundreds of people registered before we even send out the agenda, with the names of our excellent panelists today, and if I see the extent to which this report is used and referred to, and if I see the interest of so many truly excellent writers and interviewees to contribute to the mixed migration review this year, as well as in previous years, I am increasingly confident that this is exactly what these reports are becoming. Before I will tell you what's in the report this year and how that links to the discussion we'll be having today, I would like to express some words of appreciation. First of all, a big thank you to all the donors of the Mixed Migration Center, and in particular the 3 that directly supported the Mixed Migration Review this year: Switzerland, Denmark, and the Robert Bosch Foundation. Also a big thanks to the Danish Refugee Council for continuing to support MMC, to all the MMC colleagues, to Chris Horwood, one of our panelists today, and also the lead editor of the Mixed Migration Review. Of course, to all the other authors of the essay in this year's edition, the interviewees. Importantly, also our network of 4MI enumerators around the world who are interviewing refugees and migrants every day. And of course, a thank you to all the refugees and migrants themselves, more than 7,000 in the past year, who shared their stories with us, and you will find that information that they've provided to us in the report. So about the report, mixed migration remains a complex phenomenon, as Odile also said, that is constantly changing. And in the world in which it takes place is constantly changing too, not least, of course, during a global pandemic. And think of the last year alone, and all the developments that we've seen that are somehow linked to or affect migratory movements, such as the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, or the escalating situation in Ethiopia, the increased numbers we're seeing trying to reach the US southern borders, or the Canary Islands, or the UK via the channel from France, a record number of interceptions by the Libyan coast guards, mass arrests of migrants and refugees in Tripoli, massive numbers of Ethiopians being deported by Saudi Arabia, the situation on the border between Poland and Belarus, and we can go on and on. And what this highlights, apart from the often very tragic situations that refugees and migrants find themselves in all these situations, but it also highlights the need for data, evidence, research, analysis, and ongoing reflection to continuously advance our understanding of migration and inform our migration policies and programming. We need to remain curious, to keep asking questions, and to be prepared to reappraise received wisdoms. And that is exactly what we did in this 4th edition of the MMR, reframing human mobility in a changing world. For example, we raised the question whether or not internal migration and displacement should be part of our mixed migration lens. And that's something we will discuss a little bit later in more detail today. Another essay looks at the very large majority of the world's population who are not migrating, and what we can learn from a new concept of mixed immobility, which can include both voluntary and involuntary immobility. And this very much links to another important topic covered in the report, which is climate change and mixed migration, which is an area where we see so many factually incorrect and irresponsible statements about the massive numbers of future migrants due to climate change. So again, really important to have neutral and balanced evidence on this subject. In the report, we also extensively focus on South-South migration, and which does not get enough attention in global migration coverage, where there continues to be a disproportionate and often quite negative focus on the lesser phenomenon of South-North migration. We take a critical look at the ever-expanding securitization of mixed migration and the role of the private sector and defense companies that are actively lobbying for this securitization. We look at future mobility in a post-pandemic world and anti-migration politics, the issue of returns, and much, much more. And as every year, as Charlotte also mentioned, the report also includes a long and sadly growing list of what we came to call normalizing the extreme, a collection of harsh policies and actions towards refugees and migrants. For the first time, the report, however, also includes a sister feature as a necessary counterpoint with positive and progressive actions and policies, which we called resisting the extreme. But assembling this list with positive examples for this report has proven to be much more of a challenge compared to assembling a long list of harsh examples. And this, we feel, remains extremely concerning and should be a wake-up call. So to end for the discussion today, we selected two topics that basically run through most of the report. First, we will have a discussion on how to ensure a comprehensive approach, policies and programming beyond silos and mandates to human mobility in all its forms, including immobility and mobility, voluntary or involuntary, and internal or cross-border movement. And this is something that comes back in various essays in this year's report. For example, the ones I just mentioned on internal migration, on climate change, as well as on immobility. And secondly, we will discuss migration politics, policies, and narratives, and the issue I just mentioned of normalizing the extreme versus resisting the extreme. I will leave it at that and hand back to Paddy to kickstart the discussion. Please enjoy reading the report. Please join us in the discussions today, and thank you very much for joining with such a large audience today. Over to you, Paddy. Thank you.
Bram, thank you for that. Not just sharing your reflections, but I think some very important acknowledgements that you've given us, and kind of also just outlining for us from creators of the report, editors of the report, but also what the contents look like, and also setting a very nice scene, I think, for us in terms of our armchair discussion, as we are calling it. We have circulated the agenda, we have circulated the bios on the websites as well of all our panelists who are here with us today. And before we just kind of dig into that, I think it's very important, as we are going into this discussion, to know that we're looking to challenge ourselves. We're looking to question some of the approaches, I think, as Bram has rightly pointed out, and also as reflected by the other two speakers. How do we challenge our practices? How do we challenge some of the concepts that we have been moving along as we are reframing, and as we are reframing human mobility in a changing world? And for this, we are guided by these two topics, and we will try and deliberate this discussion, because as we have said, we have our 5 panelists here with us. So the idea is for us to engage with all of them. But in the interest of time, we're going to start off with the first session where we try to look and just have a deep dive into mixed migration as a lens to look at sort of the contemporary patterns of forced and voluntary human mobility and immobility. And here we look at within and across borders. And then we'll have a second session where we'll try and dive again in a bit of a different direction, but also again looking at mixed migration from the angle of politics and policies. And for all the two sessions, or rather the two sessions and the two topics that we would like to cover today, we have a very able panel that's joining us from literally across the globe. And I'm really happy to just introduce them by name, and we will get to know a little bit more about them, particularly more as they would respond to some of the questions that we will be posing to them in our discussion today. So very happy to introduce and welcome Alexandra Bilak, who is the Director of Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. You're welcome. Raphaela Schweiger, who is the Program Director for Migration at the Robert Bosch Foundation. Chris Horwood, who I think is a very familiar face to Mixed Migration Reviews, who's also co-editor of the report itself, and he is the migration specialist and the co-director at Ravenstone Consult. Odile Manganidze, who is the head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies, and last but not the least, Kamal Amakran, who is the director of Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, an adjunct professor at Columbia University. Our dear panelists, we are very happy to have you here join us. And just to kick us off then onto our first session, maybe as panelists are kind of unmuting themselves and making themselves comfortable for this ride, just to let our participants know that we do have two channels. So one is where we have the chat. Please do feel free. We have seen people greeting each other. That's always very nice. People haven't seen each other in these virtual spaces. So do let us know where you're logging in from. But let's reserve the Q&A section to direct questions to our panelists, as well as those who will be speaking later on. So to kick us off in that first session, Alexandra Bilak and Raphael Schweiger, I will put you a little bit on the spot on this, and I will come to you, Kamal, in a bit. But let's just kick it off with Alexandra. So Alexandra, can you just share with us, sort of in terms of giving us a comment on some of the key questions that have been raised in this year's report? And it's, this particular one is looking at broadening this concept that's there on mixed migration to encompass internal migration and displacement. So the question we have to you is why and why not? What kind of implications do you see in terms of policy and also for programming? Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'd like to first thank Bram and the Danish Refugee Council for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And congratulations to the MMC team for another excellent report this year. So to answer your question, it's quite a large question, Paddy, but maybe let me dive straight in and say that I think there are indeed a few arguments in favor of incorporating internal movements in the broader concept of mixed migration, but also, and I'll come to that, some potential risks that could come about as a result of doing so. So looking at the advantages or the arguments in favor, and this is something that the review itself has pointed out very clearly in its essays, and IDMC itself. We've argued that ourselves repeatedly over the years, is that including internal migration or internal displacement in broader debates on human mobility or mixed migration does do service to, I think, and acknowledges the many interconnections and overlaps even that exist between different groups of people on the move. So there is a reality on the ground there that is obvious and that is visible. Movement inside a country's border is inevitably the starting point of many onward displacement trajectories and migratory journeys. And there is indeed a visible reality that explains why it's so hard and sometimes even irrelevant, I would say, to categorize people who might follow the same journey, but also might importantly have very similar protection and assistance needs. So we've seen these overlaps clearly in situations, for example, where IDPs who can't find adequate levels of protection and assistance in their home country might, not always, but might at some point in time have no other choice but to seek that protection elsewhere across borders. And so by crossing a border, they don't necessarily tip automatically into a refugee or an asylum seeker category, but more often than not, they will join other international migrants on the move, or even in some extreme cases will fall off the radar screen entirely. And we have also documented across the world instances where the same holds true for international migrants who are returning to their home countries and who may not find an immediate solution upon their return, which means that they might then become internally displaced upon their return as a result. So those examples show that it's clear that these categories are sometimes, if not always, fluid and even interchangeable. So one person who's an IDP today could become an international migrant tomorrow, and vice versa. I think another telling example would come from situations where different populations move towards and end up living side by side in the same geographical area. So this is the case, for example, in informal settlements or in marginalized neighborhoods in cities. So if you go, for example, to the informal settlements in the city of Dhaka in Bangladesh, you'll meet all sorts of vulnerable communities who may have distinct personal histories and trajectories, but certainly today face completely identical challenges. There are people living there who arrived after being displaced, for example, by sudden onset disasters in another part of the country. You have people who may have migrated voluntarily as a result of economic or environmental pressure in coastal areas, if that's where they came from, but also poor communities from the city of Dhaka itself, who are now absorbing these new arrivals and living side by side with them. So it would be hard to argue in those particular scenarios that each different group isn't exposed in the same way and doesn't face the same challenges daily. That these groups don't require similar levels of assistance to find sources of income, to school their children, or to protect themselves from the multiple hazards that they face in those slums. So these are precisely the kind of mixed scenarios, and actually one might argue that I would say even that poverty more than migration here seems to be the common denominator, right? But anyway, these are the mixed scenarios that I think would typically justify what we've called, or what is commonly referred to as an area-based approach that allows you to then respond to all these needs concurrently and to avoid, more importantly, privileging one group over another and creating new sources of discrimination and vulnerability and future crises. So all of these examples show that there's fluidity of movements and fluidity of the categories themselves. And that certainly justifies in some contexts a more all-encompassing approach, I think, that acknowledges and that accommodates these overlapping needs and vulnerabilities. Having said that, I also think that it is important to see the risks that are inherent in broadening out the concepts too widely. For one, I think that there's a risk of diluting the category itself, right? Rendering it either confusing or even meaningless. So it's clear that there are interconnections, but just like my example of Dhaka just showed, I just question at what point you would stop including more and more vulnerable people into the category and ending up with something that just doesn't really make sense anymore. I also think, secondly, that from a practical perspective, it's important to keep in mind that forcibly displaced communities, be they IDPs or refugees, do have very specific needs by virtue of the fact that they have suffered a violation and that they have lost the right to live in their home of origin. And I think this should at minimum trigger an analysis of whether the specific vulnerability that's been created by their displacement doesn't require a specific approach and a specific response. And if anything, just if you look at it from a data perspective, we've seen at IDMC how important it is to keep track of IDP-specific numbers and trends to inform programming and advocacy to be able to shine that spotlight on a marginalized group. And I think that by bundling everything together, you would make actually data collection and evidence building ever more complicated, and it's already not that easy. But most importantly, and this is my final point, I think the largest risk here is that by broadening out the category too much, you would risk obscuring or even downplaying the very important legal and political responsibilities that are attached to these concepts and to the specific category of IDPs themselves. As you know, contrary to refugees and migrants, IDPs are rights-holding citizens of their country, and they fall under the primary responsibility of national governments, which is not the case for either refugees, asylum seekers, or migrants. And I think this explicit recognition of a state's obligation towards its residents is paramount because it provides a unique opportunity to promote national ownership, to drive nationally owned normative frameworks, and importantly, to hold governments accountable to these obligations. And so as such, I think the IDP category, and we've seen this, this has been really the subject of and the focus of the UN high-level panel on internal displacements for the last couple of years. The IDP category also offers an entry point, therefore, for tracking national and then global progress in a consistent and a systematic manner across countries and regions. And I think if we were to subsume IDPs in a broader mixed migration category, we would end up diluting or even absolving states of this primary responsibility. So in summary, I'd say that there's value in expanding the concept for the purposes of refining or nuancing our understanding of the kind of migratory or mobility phenomenon on the ground, but less so for the purposes of mobilizing and sustaining political will, for the purposes of promoting ownership and accountability, and importantly, of defining political responsibilities and investments clearly for future action. Mm-hmm. So I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you very much, Alexandra. And I'm left with a thought, and we'll come back to you again with a follow-up mm-hmm. question where we're kind of thinking about that, the focus probably on those who are left behind. So those who are unwilling to move, and, what is are we making sure that we're not forgetting about those who are not able to, or those who are not willing to move? But we'll come back to you in a bit. I think you raised another very interesting point, linking there to the city and the place of settlement. When migrants arrive into a space of migrants, refugees, IDPs, they all find commonality in a place to find shelter, and that would probably be in informal settlements, particularly in cities. So I think, Raphaela, this is a good point in bringing you in here on this conversation, knowing the important work that you do at Robert Bosch in terms of focusing on cities. We just wanted to hear from you, what you sort of see as the reality of mixed migration playing out at that city level, where you have IDPs, you have the refugees, you have migrants, often kind of converging, right? So what does this actually mean in terms of the projects and responses?
So, thanks, Paddy. And I also want to start echoing Alexandra by congratulating the Mixed Migration Center for its excellent report. We've had it a bit longer than others who were able to look at it today. It's excellent, it's timely, and it's much needed to spark some of the discussions that we are just starting to have today. And second, especially looking at cities, there is some particular articles, but there are also some streamlining through it, highlighting and mentioning the role of cities in mixed migration context. So that's in the report. I think we have all the data and the knowledge, how many displaced people live in urban areas. We know all that. What we see in practice is now more and more people in mixed migration settings and with all forms live in cities, move in cities, and that so many cities all over the world, being in small, bigger communities, respond to that in a very inclusive way, because they cannot distinguish between who has which status, who has which legal identity, and cities are dealing generally with urbanization, with climate change, with inequality, with poverty, so with so many issues where and often also a lot of vulnerable people in their cities. So for them, often the inclusive approach is the easiest. The question is how to respond to that and how to support cities in that regard, and also invest in sustainable development and jobs and green growth and everything cities have on top of their agenda, which they have also put forward in international engagements over the last years. The question, I think, really is how to support cities, how to design programs for city. And I just want to bring up some of the examples and city leaderships that came forward. And just looking back a few years, and I know we will also come back to the Global Compact and the international norms. When Marvin Rees spoke at the adoption conference of the Global Compact for Migrations, he said there is no implementation of the compact without cities and mayors who lead the way there. And when it comes to the responses, is one, they need to be inclusive and they need to address all city residents, including IDPs, migrants, whatever status, no status, undocumented people. And what we've seen is that cities have really big challenges, especially in times of the pandemic, of financial restrictions all over the world, in the Western world, in the Northern world, to access direct financing and funding for responding also to those communities. So one example that I can just highlight, and that's not us, is the Mayors Migration Council, who set up a Global Cities Fund, first on inclusive pandemic response in cities, supporting cities directly with very practical, very inclusive approaches, helping them design the projects, building up the technological support to do that. And this fund has been expanded thanks to the Open Society Foundations, the Hilton Foundation. And we are now doing with the MMC is expanding this fund to inclusive climate action, because cities are also being faced even more with climate-related migration and not having the financing mechanisms, the tools probably to set up the programs that deal with those issues. And we will come back to the climate issue, I think, also later. So I think that's one big pillar of thinking about access to financing for cities, including the actors and civil society, migrant-led groups who can make these programs really inclusive. And then the second thing that cities, I think, need in terms of responding to who's in the city, what programs they need to design, is the data and the access to the data and knowing how to use the data for the right policy purposes and getting there in a really policy oriented way. And I think including the Mixed Migration Center's work and many others in the field is how to design research in an applied way jointly with city representatives who then can take that into programming, who can develop plans according to that, and who can also then find the resources to implement some of the recommendations that come out on these questions. And lastly, I think when it comes to cities and city representatives should be here to say that by themselves is it's not only cities dealing with cities doing those kind of things, but also cities advocating for what they need and what their residents need, all of their residents. And there are mayors from around the world who organize globally, who step forward and say, we are willing to take in migrants. We don't care about the status, but we need certain acknowledgement. We need the resources to do so. So the Mayors Migration Council is of course a very prominent example. But just yesterday, mayors from across Africa and Europe came together and put forward a statement on vaccine equity, because they said they work in a project called Mayors Dialogue and Growth and Solidarity on human mobility between Africa and Europe. And they said over the weekend, listen, what's happening right now on with the new variant coming up, is we need more equity in that regard and act quickly. And I think that's very powerful to do in addition to the programming in cities.
Raphaela, thank you very much. And I think for adding those dimensions in terms of, where cities are coming in terms of crisis planning as well, and in times of the pandemic, I think we have seen how the city infrastructure and resources have sort of been overburdened in a way to say. So it's also very important, I think, to see some of the voices that are coming up from cities onto global platforms, knowing that no global mechanism out there is implementing itself by walking on top of the world, right? So just coming back again, maybe to Alexandra, and, we just kind of very, very quickly try and cover this one, because, I think even in the report, you would sort of see this concept of immobility, and where we're talking about people who are not moving. And, do you think that you can sort of have this better knowledge of different forms of immobility And here I'm particularly talking about climate change, and can that add our understanding in terms of mixed migration when we look at it from the perspective of internal migration and displacement? And I'm really trying to question, us not forgetting those who are not able to move or who are not willing to move. So in a very short space, if you could just give us a response to that. Thanks, Alexandra.
Sure. Thanks, Paddy. I'll do my best to be quick. So let me start by saying that I think, because you mentioned the issue of forced immobility, the focus on mobility and displacement should never serve as an excuse to forget about or to deprioritize those who don't have the possibility to move. And forced immobility, such as what we've seen in places like Syria, should remain an absolute priority for humanitarian and crisis response, with all the difficulties that this brings about in terms of protection and access. And we should acknowledge that in those extreme circumstances, those who don't have the possibility to flee are often going to be far more vulnerable and face more severe levels of vulnerability than those who did flee. That said, to answer your question and link it more to the issue of climate change, I think the essay in the review on immobility explains very well how adopting an immobility perspective can be of value for better understanding different types of migration drivers and other factors that can influence an individual's decision to stay or to leave. So knowing why it is that in a given situation, some people decide to leave while others decide to stay, I think can help us understand not just people's vulnerabilities and their preferences, but also different sorts of pressure points and threshold levels. And this is, of course, invaluable information, I think, for planning responses and investments. So this is very relevant in context of gradually evolving disasters and climate change, where a number of interlinked factors are going to influence those decisions. So if you take the example of coastal communities in the Pacific, many of whom prefer not to migrate or to relocate and would want to prioritize on-site accommodation and adaptation measures like building seawalls or improving drainage. All of that can be partially explained by a deep cultural attachment to land and a realization that often these fishing communities, for whom moving away would cause enormous upheaval to their cultural and spiritual heritage, in addition to the economic and the social losses that it would represent. And so I think these preferences, understanding the cultural dimension and the very personal dimension of these choices, provide extremely relevant data points for local and national governments who are now increasingly faced with the prospect of uninhabitable areas and unsustainable livelihoods and irreversible climatic changes that are going to leave them with no other choice but to plan for a difficult process of relocating these communities over the coming decades. So understanding the preferences in situ can help then support, dignified and inclusive relocation processes for the future. Mm-hmm. Another example is, of course, pastoralists, agro-pastoralists in the Horn of Africa, for whom immobility can become another form of displacement. At least that's how we've conceptualized it at IDMC, when you're looking at environmental changes that are making the pastoralist lifestyle no longer viable and forcing such communities out of a traditional means of survival that is entirely dependent on these communities' ability to move. Again, understanding those types of pressures is going to be key, I think, for providing support to these communities as they'll inevitably have to transition at some point in the future to a different lifestyle. So anyway, just to say that I think those examples, I wouldn't want to, again, bundle things together, immobility versus mobility, but some of these examples can show what can be learned from specific instances and what insights this offers for building people's resilience, for reducing their vulnerability, and ultimately for preventing or reducing the risk of future displacement.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Alexandra. Can I just bring in Kamal here? Kamal, we know, with your involvement at the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, we're wondering sort of, what lessons can we draw from here in terms of kind of also understanding, the better knowledge, the different forms of immobility and mobility, whether we're talking about, cross-border versus internal, voluntary versus involuntary, including the context of climate change. Would you like to just share with us very briefly around this topic?
Thank you, Paddy, for the floor, and I would like to follow Raphaela and Alexandra by congratulating the MMC, who are a close knowledge partner in advancing the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, but also acknowledge those around the table, particularly Raphaela, Alexandra, and others who are accomplices in advancing this agenda forward. And I picked the word of accomplice because it takes many hands to cook. So I'm very happy to be with you today. With regard to the question you raised, I will source my answer in the title of the report. I had the privilege on working on the Global Compact for Migration before day one, when we were pretty much planning how to take this forward on the margins of the 2015 crisis of the Mediterranean. And there was a big effort then under President Likotov of the UNGA on what is the best approach to reframe the conversation. And this brings me to the word reframing. And pretty much as noted by many of the actors or the speakers, you have this whole dichotomy between IDPs, migrants, refugees, internal, borders, continent. So there is always that attempt to specify in order to be able to control the narrative, control the nomenclature, understand the specific requirements, rights, protections. The problem with such an approach at the time is that many fell between the cracks. Because in definitions, it's always who sent the criteria of what and how. And particularly when we tried at the time, to have the two compacts, the compact for refugees and migrants, the New York Declaration tries to bridge these two, but somehow the forces brought us back to square one, which means migrants and refugees, despite this attempt to create that new narrative, which brings me back to the second word in the title, which is mobility. How do we get out of the nomenclatures that are post-World War nomenclatures, defined in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and to adjust them to the realities of the 21st century? So you have the word reframing, and you have the word new narrative. And this is pretty much what we tried to do through the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. And I emphasize the Africa dimension, because Africa has the ambition to be mobile, to be politically integrated, and to be economically integrated. So the dichotomies that are tried to be applied along borders or along specificities could technically, legally, administratively not apply to the continent. We have the Kampala Convention that pretty much bridges everything together. You have the free trade agreement, the African free trade agreement. You have the free movement. Myself and an African, and as a peacekeeper served in West and East Africa, most of the people don't have a passport, let alone an ID. And you know that very well, Paddy. People move around. They have been moving around for centuries, if not thousands of years. And this whole notion of a border, and this whole notion of a status, and this whole notion of a specific nomenclature, whether it lasts or not, it's foreign to them. So for once, it was important that, informed by this ambition, which was the Global Compact for Migration, which was the work that is being done at the political level, at the continental space, informed by past experiences, whether the European Union or the NAFTA within the US, Mexico, and Canada, and other exercises, how we could reframe this phenomenon through African lenses. And maybe we could be an example on which others can build, and be able to redefine the approach, redefine agency, redefine the methodology, and of course build the new networks that are necessary to bring this reframing and to bring this new narrative forward. As you know very well, when you meet someone from Uganda in Kenya, he is no migrant. He has a nickname, and I'm not going to go into the details. Or somebody from Burkina Faso in Ivory Coast, or in Dakar, or someone from South Sudan in Khartoum. the word migrant is foreign to us. And that is very important because I think that's what we should move towards. The idea is that we cannot reinvent the global system, but we can create new ecosystems. We can create new umbrellas that can capture those that fall between the cracks. As Alexandra namely mentioned, someone is today a migrant, tomorrow is first isn't a refugee, tomorrow is a migrant, the following day is a refugee. And you're gonna start looking for papers and looking for specific rights in order to be able to help him. The second point is we have an opportunity in the context of the climate crisis. And this relates to both the African continent, Central and Latin America, and Asia, because they are going to be the most affected, and they are the ones who contributed the less to this mess and to this crisis. To press forward a new narrative and a new agenda. And by new agenda, not something new per se, but this new space to bring together these different exercises along one common purpose, one common goal. At the end, whether mobility or immobility, it's an issue of vulnerability and it's an issue of rights. And I think this is where we try to redefine the conversation. And you will be surprised. And I say this as someone who served for close to 2 decades in the UN system. And for those who serve in Geneva, New York, and other places, we need to go beyond what the usual business. We need the solutions are local. The realities are local. The people affected are those on the ground. I remember when I joined the UN as an intern over 20 years ago, Sergio De Mayo told us as a group of those new interns, 80 something, he said, if you want to make a difference, go to the field. It's not in HQ. Mm-hmm. I will stop there. Over to you.
Kamal, thank you. Thank you for that. Very insightful. We could listen on and very interesting insights there. As I mentioned, we are in an interactive style and we would like to hear just a little bit from the audience. Vincent, I wonder if you are there and you are just able to raise your hand so that we can unmute you and ask you to just raise your question. It would be good if you could just direct it to any one of the panelists who has just spoken. Vincent, are you there? Okay. Vincent, you are welcome to come and share with us once again some more of your reflections. And in the interest of time, we're going to try and just move a little bit quickly to the next one. And I know we will have an opportunity also for the panelists who haven't. Oh, and he is there. I'm a little bit too fast. So let me try. I cannot see you, Vincent. So if there's somebody in the back room who can see Vincent and able to unmute. Vincent, now we see you, but there could be something with your audio. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now we hear you. Please, the floor is yours.
Very good. No, thank you. I was just reacting to one presentation and said that we have to be careful. Of course, there is no question about categorization of people when there are some basic humanitarian needs to address. And especially at a time of a pandemic or for some countries in crisis, there is no question about it. There are elementary consideration of humanity that lead us to consider everyone. However, when it gets to engaging states on the field of accountability, we need to rely on legal frameworks that exist. And I don't see any other solution around that. So I don't know. I hear you. I hear Kamal saying, well, categorization is a way to control, for state to control. But states have also responsibility and they have obligations vis-a-vis their citizens and the people on their territory. And the way to question that responsibility depends on their legal obligation. I don't see any way around that. The rest is dreaming, but I may be totally wrong. I'd like to hear you on that. What's the alternative?
Raphaela, do you want to take that one? Or Kamal, can you do it in a minute and a half? Either one of you, please take the floor.
Vincent, sorry, go ahead, Raphaela.
No, Kamal, you take that one. We will not solve that in 1.5 minutes.
No, Vincent, I can I can respond as a pragmatic person, or I can also address it as a believer person. So I'm going to decide to address it as a pragmatic person. Beyond the legalities, and we start into legalities, there is, and we will address this in the second panel, there is a major disconnect between politics, programs, and policy. And those are the 3 Ps we're trying to merge in the context of the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. That's point 1. Second, you talk about countries. Countries sign treaties. Do you have any measure of enforcement? You don't have any measure of enforcement. You see it across the globe. The only measure of enforcement it's in national courts, and then you have to rely on a strong rule of law system and a strong international and a strong legal system, which is not the case of most of the countries today. Otherwise, if you go back to the Charter of the UN, it comes down under Article 2.7 of the Charter. Unless it's a Chapter 7 resolution by the Security Council, it's interference in internal affairs. So you cannot interfere in internal affairs. You just have to rely on pretty much the legal system. So my point is just to corner member states and to tell them you have these obligations and you have to do it. Most of them, they will tell you, we can't do it. So I think we have to reinvent how we engage with member states. And we have to re-engage this relationship of authorities, whether it's national, continental, international, but I will go down to local and even to neighborhoods. I think it's just by going through treaties, and it showed the limits of it. Look at Europe today, which is the berceau of democracy and the berceau of human rights. In proper French, c'est le chaos. Over to you.
Kamal, thank you for that. And I know we have a lot that we could cover on this particular topic. So, Raphaela, Odile, and Chris, and also Alexandra, if you have some burning points later on, we'll be able to just come back and, zero back in onto this topic. I think it's a good point for us. And I probably don't have to repeat to the participants that you can share messages in the chat, but also in the Q&A, and also prepare yourselves for like a minute coming in at some point when we're speaking. But it's a good point for us to move on to the next topic, talking about mixed migration politics and policies. And Odile, I wondered if I could just, bring you in on this one. The report includes some essays, 2 in particular, that look at South-South migration and on a lesser known mixed migration routes around the world. What trends and shifts do you see in terms of policies and politics from African countries, and what can we learn in terms of the key developments in the regional migration landscape? I know it's a mouthful, and I'm about to add 2 more, Odile, so forgive me for that. And we're also kind of interested in this concept of, resisting the extreme. And I know Chris is looking at me and thinking, you have to say that, right? Resisting the extreme, looking at it from an African perspective. And also, if you may, just touch on that issue of, securitization of migration policies and what we're sort of seeing as, weaponization of migration, but also the role of the security and defense sector in migration. So Odile, a mouthful, but I'm sure you're able to take it for us. Break it down for us.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and a special thanks to the co-panelists, but also to everyone who put in lots of work into what I believe is the best mixed migration review so far. And that's not to say the ones before were not great, but it just means that the team is improving with each year. I'm actually going to start with your second question, Paddy, around securitization of migration, and I suppose the related shifts that we are starting to see on the continent. In his question earlier, or question/comment written down, Vincent spoke about how we define people, for example, using the West African context, a person moving between Burkina Faso and Ghana, given the existence of a free movement zone as enacted through the Economic Community of West African States, wouldn't by definition be considered to be an international migrant, unless of course they chose to settle. And I start in that region, which is far away from where I am in Southern Africa, because we've seen how externalization of securitized policies has impacted efforts towards regional integration, freedom of movement in a zone that was moving very quickly towards freedom of movement. We have seen what it means for a poor, young country like Niger to be confronted with so many offers for practical training that are basically hinged on limiting movement through and from Niger. And the suggestion that by blocking movement, you can be able to contain in regions. Now, I move from West Africa to Southern Africa, where efforts towards regional integration have been impeded in part because of seeking to adopt otherwise securitized migration policies, not in all countries, but in some. A few years ago, the ISS did specific research looking at what are the prospects for freedom of movement on the African continent. And while a lot of the literature at the time was suggesting it could be difficult, we actually mapped the bilateral and multilateral arrangements across the continent that mean over at the time, 42 countries were in some form of a free movement regime, whether bilaterally or in a regional format, which meant it's not that impossible. So going to your first question then around policy shifts, what we are seeing, and it will be interesting to see what comes out of the current engagements that heads of state are having with the view to informing their position when Africa and the European Union meet in early 2022, because we are seeing a stronger positioning together of African states around certain migration policies and positions. Now, some of them come unexpected. You will know that over the weekend, starting from Friday, a number of restrictions were imposed on travel from Southern Africa on the discovery of Omicron. Now, we haven't spoken about COVID-19, even though the reality is we're probably going to be living with it for longer beyond it's a pandemic when we have it under control. Now, a lot of the questions that were raised then about whether or not this was the right move on Europe's part and what impact it would have on the way in which Africa perceives European policies vis-a-vis Africa's point of departure. And I'm going to underline what Africa's point of departure is when it comes to questions of migration. It's ideally a developmental lens. And I say ideally because, of course, there will always be concerns raised at an individual country level. But ideally, it's at a developmental level and recognizing that migration is very much a demographic issue as well. So where you are unable to have the right employment opportunities, and Frederick Odiambo posed this question in the chat or made a comment around what can we be able to do to actually allow the things that people are leaving their home countries because they do not have the opportunities, whether it's employment, whether it's access to sustainable resources, whether it's people who would prefer to be farmers in farming communities that are unfortunately displaced because of flooding, and there's no mechanisms in place to ensure the safety and security of their livelihoods. Forget their lives for a moment, the security and safety of their livelihoods. What do you do at a national level to be able to address that? And I'm going to end, Paddy, by saying we are seeing at national level a recognition that ultimately, if we ensure inclusive development and growth, some of these questions will answer themselves. Now, how do you go about that? Already, it's conversations between states where you see higher movements of people from, let's say, Zimbabwe into South Africa, having the bilateral conversation around what it is they need to do to work together. And by way of a footnote and then a full stop, Paddy, this is a recognition that people will migrate. It's a reality. We can repeat it until the cows come home, but people will migrate. The duty then on states in terms of policy and practice is to find sustainable ways to govern migration that don't put us a few steps back. Thank you, Paddy.
Odile, thank you for that. And we have a lot of comeback questions, and we will switch up to you in a moment. And I think you've just set us on the right foot there. We bring in Chris, and Chris, I want to take you back to, into the mixed migration review. And there's a section there, which talks about normalizing the extreme and kind of lists, the extreme migration policies, and this list seems to be growing each and every year. And at the same time, you've got a list that has been added for the first time this year, which we're calling a sister section, which is resisting the extreme. So one is normalizing the extreme and the other one is resisting the extreme. So Chris, which list was easier to compile and why? And why are we seeing this trend? What is the role of politics, a topic that we know that you talk about in this essay, in some of the essays that you've done this year? Chris.
Yes, okay. By far, the list of extreme actions, either in violations of rights or actions against accepted norms, was much easier to write. Often these actions or events are more publicized by the media, they're more researched by human rights groups, and they generally create noisy political controversy or drama. Resisting the extreme is much harder to research and even to frame conceptually. I mean, where do you draw the line in terms of what to include as resisting the trend to extreme, and what is just business? What is just migration management business as usual? What's going on as usual? I mean, essentially, Europe doesn't want to accept migrants rescued in the Mediterranean, but when they do, and they allow rescue ships to dock and disembark, is this really resisting the extreme, or was their hand forced? The same countries are practicing pushbacks and facilitating Libya with interceptions and redetentions. And then in some cases, what looks like resisting the extreme is just normative interpretations of immigration policies, or just the outworkings of systems and procedures set to accept asylum seekers and refugees, or integration policies at a city or a national level. In the case of specific changes to policies that appear more pro-refugee or pro-migrant, there were some notable cases. I mean, for example, if we look at the 5.6 million Venezuelans, mainly welcomed in South American and Caribbean countries in recent years, it's remarkable. Also, Turkey and the neighbors to Syria have taken in millions in recent years. These are very positive trends that need to be noted. Again, the epidemic has thrown up special cases where numerous countries have relaxed visa restrictions and changed all kinds of policies, giving more recognition to migrants as frontline workers in particular. The ODI have got a very elegant interactive online graphic listing hundreds of cases of this. But at the same time, we see COVID also being used as a pretext and a reason to block movement and reinforce borders, like the use of Tier 42 in the United States. Various people interviewed for this MMR talk a lot about this aspect. Also, to what extent will these more inclusive policies be continued after the pandemic? There's no guarantee at all, and therefore are they just currently expedient, or has COVID been a real game changer? So should they be included in resisting extreme? These are the kind of conceptual dilemmas we were faced when writing this new section, and we'd be really interested in feedback on this new section to see if it should become a regular feature in future MMRs. I noticed in one of the comments someone suggesting it should be called Normalizing the Solutions, but even that title is problematic because solutions suggest there's a problem, so is migration a problem? And so it is semantically and conceptually interesting. In terms of trend, however, if I can just end, I would say that the dominant political trend is still leaning very much to the extreme and the normalization of the extreme, sadly.
Chris, thank you for that. And indeed, some very interesting insights that are coming in from the chat, as well as people are making reflections and comments on, on what the panel here is sharing. So thank you very much for those questions coming in. Actually, Kamal, as I give you your question, I'm going to go into the chat and look at the question that Daniel Davis has shared, where he's asking about the Global Compact, and that's what we were going to bring you on, to talk about, and he says, to what extent do you feel that the Global Compact and so both compacts, the one on migration and refugees, have reinforced the rigid division between refugees and other migrants, either in the text of the compact or in their implementation? And what can be done to improve this?
First to David, it's a very good question. And it was, and I acknowledge it, it was one of the failures of the post-New York Declaration where, as I mentioned earlier, we tried to merge and create a common umbrella in order to be able not to reinvent, but to build the bridges between the different clusters of either nomenclature, protection, spaces, etc. And somehow that there are windows of acceleration, either under specific leadership or as a result of specific shock. And the window closed, and we went back to the old business, which means we have refugees, we have the Geneva Convention, we need to protect it, and then there is migration or migrants. I give one example. Our initial attempt was to have the entire climate dimension brought forward in the context of the GCR, because as mentioned rightly by other speakers, the protections were clear, and there was a big pushback, and then we had to build this entire space on bringing up climate as or the climate crisis as a driver of forced mobility or a driver of migration in the GCM. So indeed, but I think the GCM, how it was constructed, because it's a document of the member state, how it was negotiated, the follow-up mechanism, how it was voted, as in a conference, not in a room in the -1 of the UN HQ, gives space to build a new narrative or a common narrative, and I think that's an opportunity. The GCM, it's not a document, it's a process. The GCR, it's a statement. And you will see in 5 years, and I say this to colleagues at the UNHCR, no one will speak about the GCR because you will need to find new momentum. But the GCM, how it was built, it's a process. And we need to build on every opportunity to be able to inject that impetus. And particularly what just Chris mentioned, I think that the extremes are always going to be there, and they have always been there, as he rightly noted. I think the question here is whether the progressive side will be imaginative enough, creative enough, innovative enough to overwhelm that narrative, to inject momentum, to bring compassion forward. It has never been a crisis of migration. It has never been a crisis of refugees. It's a crisis of cooperation. As you rightly noted, Chris, Colombia took 3 million to 4 million migrants, refugees, displaced persons from Venezuela. How much Europe, the second largest economy in the world, took? And if you take Germany, then we are in trouble. Turkey took over 3.5 million. Uganda, how many South Sudanese Uganda took? How many displaced person from Congo, Angola took? No one speaks of Angola. It's over 1 million persons. And you name it, you go around. The problem is that we need to be smarter. We need to be more innovative. We need to be creative. And we need to overwhelm them with ideas, with opportunities, and with solutions. Not to manage, but to harness mobility for human equity. And I go back, when it comes to the African continent, it's a developmental issue. And you see it from the politics. If you are speaking to the Latin American group as countries, it's a human rights issue. Mm-hmm. If you speak to the African group, it's a development issue. If you speak to the European group, it's a security issue. You see it, how the groups and really negotiate, come together. And Asia, it's a mismatch, whether you are with Bangladesh, Japan, Singapore, China, the Gulf countries, it's a bit of everything. But it's very regrettable that those aspects, can define how we could leave no one behind. Mm-hmm. To go back to the SDGs. Over to you.
Kamal, thank you for that. In terms of us understanding what it means to harness migration, it's not something for us to actually manage. And I think echoing a lot of what Odile had also just mentioned in the wrap up of her sharing. We do have a burning question, but there is a much more burning question that is in the chat. So I think let's just see if we can bring on Constancia Sporchi, if I'm not mistaken with your pronunciation. Are you able to raise your hands so we can see you and unmute you? Yes. Constanza, please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, when you talk about resisting the extreme, if you also include like civil society networks and even citizens networks, because during I'm a journalist, and during my several reportages around Europe, but also in the Middle East and North Africa, I've witnessed lots of citizens building up networks, trying to rescue and help migrants in several occasions. So I was wondering how NGOs are actually working with these newborn networks, like also, for example, in the border between Belarus and Poland in these days. And also, it happened that we managed to speak with some migrants that were protesting. They've been protesting for a month at least. There were like 3,000 migrants, mixed migrants, in front of the community center of UNHCR in Tripoli, Libya. They were asking for protection, and actually nobody was able to help them. Even UNHCR, from what I've been told, closed down. They had to close their headquarters there for security reasons. So I'm wondering, we're talking about like resisting the extreme, trying to protect migrants, but when they organize and they ask for themselves to be helped, actually, are we able to really help them? Thank you very much.
Chris, how do we respond to Migrants Agency? Do you want to take that in 2 minutes?
Well, I just have to talk as the editor of this and the sort of coordinator of the MMR. I mean, that's the question. That's the issue with this particular title is if you open the gates, I mean, there are literally thousands of fantastic and positive initiatives going on. I mean, every city in the world has initiatives, positive ones that are worthy of talking about. So many NGOs are involved in, so many civil organizations are involved in this. So, you know, I mean, we're not here to reference and catalog everything. And of course, you'd miss some, and then they would be upset. And then even IOM and UNHCR, they're doing fantastic work across the world. So we didn't want to just be documenting the those things. It's not for our job to do that. So we are still a bit confused about that section of the report. How do we frame this? Are we just going to do the big headline titles of policy level major political movements that fall into the category of resisting the extreme? But in some way, we wanted to note the fact that it isn't just negative out there. There's a lot of nasty stuff going on and extreme stuff, but there is a lot of positivity. But how to frame that? And is it, in fact, MMC's job or the MMR's job to frame that? So I'm answering with a question. Sorry.
Thank you. That's the point of the discussion as well, that you can answer, even though my English teacher used to say, you can never answer a question with a question. Well, my teacher of English, must correct, she would probably not be very happy with me with that. But then just wondering if I could pose another question to Raphaela. And in a way of us kind of, you know, we've talked about data, we've talked about, you know, we've talked about policy narratives and so on. So we're kind of trying to bring these two words together. We want to look at data, we want to look at analysis and research. And at the other side, you have policy and policy narratives and the responses that these have in terms of, you know, and how they impact on migration. What actually is the role of data? And maybe Raphaela, very briefly, if you could kind of talk to us, you know, in terms of what you see from predictions. You know, we're often seeing these predictions about numbers, for instance, of displaced persons due to climate change, or we'll see, you know, different figures and numbers that are coming out. Of course, it's in terms of planning and programming, but the question is, does this really help or not? Raphaela?
The short answer to your question, does this really help, is yes. The question is, I think, how and which data and how do we what data are we creating? How are data producers collaborating, and how are we moving forward? And for example, the beautiful thing about the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative Kamal was talking about is that we will have both qualitative data by the Mixed Migration Center, and we will have quantitative climate modeling work from Columbia University, and combining those data will really help inform some of the key questions that we will have around climate migration and climate forced displacement in Africa in that particular case. And I think when it comes to policy is that we all have to ask ourselves, and I think the MMC is doing an excellent job in that regard, is how can we produce data and inform policymakers about those data and findings in a way that helps them inform their decision-making processes. And that's easily said, but that's a very hard, long-standing process, also in international processes, like the DCM and the IMRF review and follow-up process. But also in national and very regional and local context. And I spoke also about what kind of data, for example, municipalities can access, or civil society organizations working in border contexts. Are they producing data? Which data can they use to observe? Also human rights violations. And then there's another layer coming in, which is new technologies that generate completely new forms of data. And I think that's a very interesting space, and we just had here in Berlin a conference with the Big Data for Migration Alliance yesterday, where we also talked about the very particularities of certain data and forecasting, and what it means for policymaking, and how we bring those spaces together, and how can people talk to each other about also what to do with these data, about the human rights implication, how can we use the data in a way that they would, lead up to, at the end of the day, make people's lives better. And that's a long way in terms of what is technologically possible, who will have access, and how data collection is framed. I could speak for a while about that, but I think that's where we will need to look at going forward. And it's objective one of the DCM, and as we will have the International Migration Review Forum and all that, we will look at all these questions going forward, I think, very concretely. And the Mixed Migration Center will play an important role in that regard.
No, absolutely. And I think the report also, has been very good in outlining what kind of key developments have happened on, global migration framework with the reviews themselves. Kamal, I see it's a burning hand, so I will let you take a minute. And then Odile, I think we would like to just hear from you on that particular question in relation to data. Before I just ask you to unmute Kamal, audience, our dear participants, please feel free to engage with us and just keep sharing the questions. And also, if it's possible for you to direct them to a particular panelist, that would make it even more easier for us. Kamal, and then we have Odile.
Thank you, Paddy, for the floor. I just would like to build on what Raphaela mentioned, and particularly when it comes to the global south. There are three important questions. One is the sovereignty of data. Who owns the data? And the data to serve whom? And this is very important. This is why we need to ensure that we learn from the mistakes of the past. That transfer of knowledge, of capacity needs to be done early in this process when it comes to the new digital world. We should not wait. Otherwise, we're creating a new sense of poverty and a new sense of disenfranchising an entire community. That's one. Second is who interprets the data, the interpretation of the data. Somebody seated in Nairobi and he looks at the data of Nairobi is going to read differently than someone seated in Rabat, or someone seated in New York, or someone seated in Geneva. So the answers need to be locally anchored. We cannot pursue the approach that we had post Second World War, the last 77, 78 years. It's that combination between the global, the continental, the national, and the local. Last but not least, it's to democratize access to data. Because how many people can read data and understand it? Unless it's graphs that are simple, unless that it's something that is accessible, very few people can understand. The standards of diffraction, the standards of deviation, the methodology that was pursued. So we need to democratize data. The answer it's with this. The solution is with the citizens, and we need to empower them. And we need to empower them by empowering agency. whether as a collective, namely cities, mayors, etc., or as a nation through states, or as a continental group, whether it comes to the African Union, ECOWAS, and others. So those 3 points: sovereignty, democratization, and interpretation. Otherwise, data just for the sake of data is just numbers. Over to you.
Odile.
Thanks a lot, Paddy, and thank you to Kamal for really making my job a lot easier, to be honest. So I really appreciate your inputs. Earlier today, we launched the National Migration and Urbanization Forum in South Africa. This is a government-led initiative that was recently approved by Cabinet, of which non-governmental organizations, I work for one, are part of the forum. One of the things that we discussed, and this is at a national level, was, quite frankly, there is insufficient data. And the point that Kamal makes, which is around almost the democratization of data, is sometimes those who hold the data don't necessarily release it to the public for own interpretation or otherwise. Now, it's important to note who chairs, so to speak, this new forum on migration and urbanization. It's the Statistics Office. So a conscious decision almost on the part of South African government to not make the department responsible for home affairs or interior security or interior affairs, depending on where you are, to be the one that holds the pen, so to speak, for the forum, but to be part of the forum. A conscious decision also not to make social affairs to be the pen holder, because obviously they have their own specific invested interests. So to almost give the pen to the numbers people. So the people who would inform whatever forward-looking planning is there, but to still involve researchers, practitioners, non-governmental and governmental within the process of the forum. Now, I use that as an example, not least because it's the easiest. It just happened this morning, but also because it speaks to a recognition by a country where a lot of the anti-migrant sentiments have been rooted in the lack of data, in the lack of information. So people create information for themselves. People scapegoat if they can. And the example I used earlier that I'll use today is when you have a range of issues affecting your society, be it poverty, inequality, crime, violence, unemployment, who are the first people that you can think, you know what, if we get rid of these people, maybe these problems will be less. It's the ones that are deportable. If you are a person who can stay and has right of stay, it's difficult to attribute blame. And we've seen that manifesting, and there's a lot of research that has been done by organizations on the African continent that doesn't always reach the desks of people outside of the continent. And it was great to see IOM, for example, launch their first Africa migration report that speaks to how the majority of migration happens on the continent, and most of it is circular, but also that a lot of people, if they could, would prefer to have a base at home and still have the option to move. When you don't have the option to move is when you now then choose a place of settlement. Now, and I'll end on this point, Paddy, on how can data help? Quite frankly, they are already sharing agreements between, for example, Zambia and Zimbabwe in respect of border crossings between the two countries, something that does not exist to the south of Zimbabwe with South Africa. So the idea would be, at least at sub-regional level, if you have a shared data point that does away with conjecture, that allows people, when we say, for example, there are 200,000 people in such and such a town, there is complementary data from the neighboring nations or whatever that confirms that. At the moment, we don't have. And in the absence of data and information, what plays? Misinformation. And what creates violence? Disinformation.
Odile, thank you. Thank you for those reflections. we just go into the audience and ask, John Bingham, are you there? And can you just, let's see if you are able to.
Yes, I think so, Patty.
Hi, John, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm happy and intimidated to follow Odile just a minute ago, because I wanted to come back to some of the things that were talked about in the comment box with Bram and Costanza and also Chris Horwood in this terrific discussion of this fine report. On solutions and all, I don't think that that the report and the picture the report puts forward, the data that the report presents is complete without some solutions, and I mean even a fair sampling of solutions. It doesn't mean all any more than the center of the report talks to all the migrants, or talks in necessarily all the regions with mixed movement, but some standout solutions in feature snapshots. I think, as Odile said, similar to with data, if you don't have data, we have ignorance, and worse. Well, if we don't have solutions, we have ignorance and worse. With respect to COVID, and solutions are not just resisting the extremes. Solutions are everyday problems that aren't necessarily extremes, like exclusion and abuse of workers and racism and violence on borders that doesn't necessarily rise to an extreme. It's banal even. It's everyday, and the solutions are there as well. Again, we always have to wrestle with which solutions are they best practices or not, but some are, and certainly the Mixed Migration Center and with its expertise and rigor can put forward quite a number of solutions without putting them all forward. On COVID practices, it was very stimulating to hear Chris make reference to ODI and other lists of practices that have been somewhat surprising in a positive way during COVID time. And we all know that there were all sorts of mixed motives for some of those surprising practices. But some of them were from the civil society side. I'm with the NGO Committee on Migration in New York. Some of them have been the kind of practices on regularization, alternatives to detention, access to services that we in civil society never imagined we'd see in any circumstances much. Firewalls that we were pushed back on when the Global Compact was developed. So absolutely we should raise some of those up. I don't think we wait for things to be permanent or adopted universally in order to raise them up as possible solutions. And lastly, the word solutions, we wrestle with that quite a bit in civil society, across the board. But a solution is not just to, we're not saying migration's a problem. We're saying the policy responses are often a problem. And as I mentioned, exclusion and racism, violence, and worker abuse, those are the problems that we need practices and solutions to raise up. Thanks.
John, thank you for sharing those insights, and I will ask Chris to tackle that one in a moment. Can I just come back a bit on the data question, and let's just keep this one at the back of our minds, Chris, in terms of the proposed solutions, and I think Odile has also just echoed this in the chat as well, to talk about a living discussion beyond the report that looks at the recommendations and proposed solutions, adding on to what John has shared here. So Chris, a bit of digestion for you as you are coming back. Alexandra, do you want to talk a little bit to us about the data, data in relation to internally displaced populations?
Thanks a lot, Paddy. No, indeed, I just wanted to come back to some of the points that have been made already, and in a sense, our contribution to the resisting the extreme parts that the report refers to comes from our responsibility and our work towards responsible and accurate reporting on the issue of internal displacement. At IDMC, we face a lot of misunderstanding and misuse of our global and aggregated figures. often we see how they can be misused or diverted even to support from their original purpose, to support a particular political agenda. So we do take our global monitoring and reporting responsibility very seriously, and we've started to feel this risk more and more acutely over the years. So just to give an example, our global numbers of IDPs have basically risen consistently since we started monitoring at the end of the 1990s. We've now reached 55 million IDPs in 2020, and this number is often met with a sense of shock and tragedy and a sense of hopelessness by our readers who say, how is it possible that we have so many IDPs across the world? Well, yes, there is a reality to those numbers and a sense that the phenomenon is growing in scale and in complexity. I mean, it's every country in the world now almost that is affected by this issue. But there's also, there are also clear methodological reasons for why we've got more and more IDPs across the world. We don't. We've improved our monitoring capacity, so we've got access to more data now than we had before. We're now reporting on displacement, not just new displacements, but also protracted displacement, including in disaster contexts. And we're not very good, and neither are any of our data partners on the ground, in defining or reporting on the end of displacement in certain situations, right? So when people die or reach a solution, often that's not captured in the data. So as a result, the numbers keep rising. But I think the most important thing is to, whilst we acknowledge all those methodological challenges, is to be as transparent and as accurate as possible in explaining the numbers, so as to minimize the risk of misuse and diversion or use for kind of sensationalist purposes. We saw the same happening with the World Bank's Groundswell reports, which is often only cited for the number that it puts forward of whatever it is, 260 million climate migrants, which is actually the most extreme scenario that is put forward in the reports. But these are the numbers that, in a sense, contribute, IDMCs and everyone else's, that contributes to a sensationalist approach to reporting on migration and displacement, and that I think really needs to be countered. So at IDMC, this is why we're investing very heavily in building up relationships with media outlets, with journalists, to educate even journalists and ensure that they're reporting much more accurately on it, that they themselves understand the subtleties in the numbers. It certainly doesn't mean that we should stop producing and publishing this data, because it does provide policymakers with the necessary information to inform their decisions, but and particularly at national level. But it does mean that more effort needs to be done in rigor and transparency, but also in supporting some of the recommendations. And I'd like to echo what Kamal was referring to about national ownership of the data. Some of the recommendations that have now been put forward by the high-level panel on internal displacement are about a more strategic or a better use of data and evidence for the purposes of building and sustaining political will, particularly political will at national and local level. So what kind of data is really needed to equip governments with the means to make those decisions and show accountability and leadership? And I think this has to be very much a collaborative effort, but that collaborative effort has to happen in full dialogue and transparency. So this is a commitment that we make at IDMC, but obviously we still have a lot to learn. But we're encouraging all of our data partners to join us in that effort. So, thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Kamal, can you come in? Can I give you a Swiss half minute? If you unmute yourself, you're already taking 20 seconds of your time. If you can unmute yourself, Kamal, please go ahead. The floor is yours. Sorry, Kamal, we can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alexandra just mentioned the last point I wanted to raise. It's the data, it's a means, it's not the end. And I think that's what we should get out of. It's not about the numbers, but it's numbers for what and towards what and for which purpose. And we have this big debate because we have been running models now for close to a year to build an inclusive modeling exercise. And we are discussing what should we bring forward and to which end. And I think I would like to emphasize one point here is the data needs to help us understand the challenges, The data needs to help us understand the various vulnerabilities and their nature. The data needs to help us primarily understand the scope of needed response. When we talk, for example, about climate forced displacement and migration, and you speak about Africa getting 200 or 300 million to address for adaptation in the context of the climate crisis, that is peanuts compared to what is needed to address bluntly the human dimension of the climate crisis. And I think that's where data help us to understand the scope of the response that needs to be brought forward. But as Alexandra mentioned and Odile, it's upon us, the organizations, the people, to do it differently and to bring this data forward differently in order to avoid being used and abused, which it's not to be disregarded because they will always try. Over to you. Thank you again.
Kamal, thank you for that. Chris, we bring you on the spot to be brief on the proposed solutions, but I think one question we need to ask you, and this is a trick question because I think this is a question you usually ask. Are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist? Or are you something in between? And we're really referring to, looking at 2 years, the mixed migration review focused on, the future of mixed migration, everything happening in between, megatrends, global pandemic. What is the future?
Well, I'm much more uncomfortable being asked that than asking other people. I'm nervous of pessimism because, as someone wrote, pessimism, if it becomes a habit, can reinforce a narrative of unstoppable decline. And, it's as if there's nothing we can do, then that releases us from obligation. And also your question is a bit ambiguous, as you know, because it doesn't specify what optimistic mixed migration looks like and from whose perspective. I guess what we're talking about is whether things will be harder or tougher for those in mixed migration flows and those who want to move. I think it will be tougher in the short term. But the truth is, there are contradictory trends going on at work in the world. There are longer term trajectories that suggest the world become more hostile and more closed to migrants as people revert to forms of cultural nativism or as AI technology replaces most jobs. But at the same time, other trajectories suggest there will be greater demand for and openness to migrants, for example, as part of the sort of unfinished business of globalization, changing global demand and supply of labor, and in the developed world, particularly as populations decline and elderly populations dominate. And let's not forget the potentially positive development of global migration governance too, which Kamal has been focusing on a lot today. Personally, I question whether models of migration theory used in the past and even today will be applicable in the near future world, where inequality may become more monumental than today. Remember, all the projected global population increases in the next 3 decades is going to take place in Africa and Asia countries, and in countries that almost certainly won't be able to give many of them jobs. That's without the fact that the most severe impacts of climate change and global heating, which our leaders seem intent on not halting, will take place in the most vulnerable and populous countries. These are potentially incendiary factors.
Sorry, Chris, to interrupt. Do you mind to just move your microphone? We lost it for a second there.
I didn't touch my microphone. So I'm saying if you add to the fact, most of you can hear me clearly now? Yeah. If you add the issue of the most severe impacts of climate change and global heating, which we're not halting at the moment, if they're going to take place in the most vulnerable and populous countries, these are potentially incendiary factors. But they're not necessarily pessimistic. They're shocking, they're disruptive, and possibly transformative, but they're not necessarily pessimistic. History tends to pull unexpected rabbits out of its hat. But finally, on the last paragraph, I do want to address the issue of asylum and refugees. I think the current global regime is unworkable. And although many resist seeking its reform or review, it is a broken, limping system at the moment, and it needs attention. The currency of asylum has lost value. In his interview, Jeff Crisp in the MMR describes it as fragile and lacking international solidarity at the moment. Only those with no choice hope against hope for formal resettlement through UNHCR. The rest are voting with their feet. They pay smugglers or they try any way they can. Almost everyone who's on the move irregularly claims asylum. At the same time, the political appetite to resettle refugees is seriously low. And We have still yet to settle the question around climate justice and the climate displaced populations that are yet to come in large numbers, or are they? There are also complexities around the return of failed asylum seekers that only adds to people's lack of trust on how states are managing all this. Is there bound to be a refugee regime car crash? I'm asking, I don't know. Or will it just cease to be relevant and wither away as states bypass the agreed international approaches? But again, if there is a crash, something better could come out of it. Perhaps, I have to conclude, I'm pessimistically optimist. I think the situation is rocky and rough, but I think there may be all kinds of surprises and interesting developments in the future.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Chris. And I think it was a very good end to our interactive discussion here on these two sessions, but also in trying to unpack the report. We touched on many different elements. Thank you again to the participants that were able to just engage with us. And we hope that it was as challenging and as interactive for you as it was for us here on the panel. And for now, I will hand over back to Bram to just give us a 1 minute way forward.
Thank you very much, Paddy. And let me start with really a big thanks to all the panelists for an excellent discussion, and of course to you, Paddy, for great moderation. When we started this series of reports 4 years ago, we said the MMR should be a platform for debate, for different voices, for thought-provoking ideas. And I think that's exactly what happened during this discussion today. This was really great. We heard great ideas. We had quite some discussions. We didn't agree on everything with each other. And I think that's exactly what we try to achieve here and what we try to facilitate this type of discussion. Great questions also from the audience. Many thanks to the audience. I see over 100, well over 100 people who stayed with us, even though we're 15 minutes over time, which is really reassuring. We would also like to invite people to continue the conversation with us on Twitter. There's the hashtag MMR 2021. So please do post questions there. We'll try to answer those on Twitter, on social media as well. Maybe one other thing to mention that came up in the discussion on resisting the extreme or normalizing solutions. I think that's great. And next year will be a sort of an anniversary for the MMR, existing for 5 years. We have been thinking that we should dedicate that issue next year to solutions. I mean, we can't keep on analyzing and pointing to problems. I think we have a responsibility as MMC also to come up with solutions. So this could very, very well be a topic maybe for next year's MMR 2022. But stay tuned for that. So again, big thanks to all our panelists. Big thanks to the audience, and over to you, Paddy, to formally close. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And as the thanks are coming in, I think it's just, congratulations once again to the Mixed Migration Center and all the different partners, all the different contributors to the report. A job well done. We look forward into diving into this report. And thank you to our able panelists who were able to dive into many different areas to help us deliberate today and enjoy this launch. Thank you to everyone, and have a good afternoon, evening, and a good night to those in Asia Pacific. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paddy.
And thank you, Paddy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paddy. It was excellent, to your credit.
Oh, thank you, Kamal. I mean, we always say that the moderator